Well, hello, everybody, and we're doing, and welcome to this. We're doing a panel on sports washing. And we're going to have three perspectives here, from a journalist, from an expert on Middle East politics in particular, and from an athlete who happens to be a GW student, who happens to be a journalist. Let me introduce my wonderful, distinguished panel. I'm Chuck Todd, by the way. I went to GW. I'm on the board here of the School of Media and Public Affairs, and so I am here as a facilitator because I care a lot about this issue as well, and sports journalism. I always say this: what sports leagues are attempting to do to journalists are what politicians wish they could do to journalists, and we will discuss that throughout this. So I'm all about figuring out how we can draw lines in sports journalism, because if we don't draw those lines, they're only going to harm us when we deal with government and all of this stuff. So that is my motivation for being here, and I'm excited to be facilitating this panel. Right next to me is Professor Kelsey Nelson. She is a longtime sports journalist, NBC Sports, Fox Sports, but she's also worked for entities in Washington Commanders. She's lived in this odd world, right, where you work for a team but also are a journalist. We're going to discuss that because I think it's a unique situation that we've seen pop up with the leagues. And sort of the challenges you have faced. Nelson, by the way, was named the Washington Chiefs DC Media Person of the Year, so that's just pretty cool. She's also vice president of the Washington Association of Black Journalists and is a committee lead for the SPJ's Sports Committee. Next to her is Professor Will Youmans. Will is an expert in Middle Eastern politics and global news. He's been involved with writing an award-winning paper on CIA recruitment in Arab Detroit. He's written a book entitled Unlikely Audience, Al Jazeera's Struggle in America, detailing how the Qatari-owned outlet, Al Jazeera, attempted to become a player in the United States media landscape. And let's just say Qatar is going to be playing a starring role in this panel for many reasons, including their attempts to own every single sports team in this town. And next to him is Avril Silva. She is a sophomore right here at GW. Let's go Revolutionaries. God bless her. She's majoring in journalism and mass communications, minor in international affairs. She's a member of the GW women's soccer team, and you might be impressed with that. But she's also a member of the Venezuelan national women's soccer team. How about that? So you're gonna win a World Cup?
Hopefully one day.
Exactly. That'll be fun. Just not against our girls. Right? She's also a writer for The Hatchet and founder and president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists chapter right here at GW. So. Thank you all. Will, I'm going to let you kick off this discussion because I think the most high-profile sports washing takes place in these large events. World Cup, the Olympics. I'll give you one quick anecdote being at NBC during the Sochi Winter Olympics. We were covering what was happening as a news division, including the concern a lot of gay athletes had about being in Russia at the time. And I had the president of NBC Sports go to me and goes, "What's it with you news guys? Are you only interested in gay rights in Russia for the 2 weeks that I'm putting on a program?" And I understood the complaint. He was making a business. He's saying, "Hey, look, I'm in business with these people." And we're sitting here going, well, our job is to try to surface some issues that we think matter. They wanted to be on the world stage to present one story. We're here to tell you, hey, careful what you're seeing on the other side. But this is the tension. I bring that up because I saw this tension up close and personal between the journalists and the sports producers, and we know that it's with the teams and all of this stuff. So I start with that anecdote, Will, and explain, like, right now the Gulf states in particular, they really see an opportunity here, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and but I think with events, it's kind of a complicated issue because events bring a lot of scrutiny. And so the definition of sports washing, if we want to, posit a definition, is that I think using big events or using sports as a way to deflect from negative attributes such as, human rights abuses and those kinds of things, right? So it might be that events are not actually the epicenter for sports washing.
Hitler, 1936, the best first example?
Well, what Hitler was trying to do was trying to show off Nazism, right? So was he trying to deflect from the horrors of Nazism, or was he trying to propagate a positive image for that ideology? And of course, it backfired in many ways, thanks in part to the success of Jesse Owens. So sometimes events are more about prestige than deflection, because events actually invite a lot of scrutiny. Before the Qatar hosted the World Cup, who was covering the migrant issue, migrant abuse issue? Most of the reporting was actually being done by Al Jazeera English in terms of English language coverage. So, then all of a sudden BBC and all the U.S. news industry sort of became interested in that, which is an important issue. But it also led to a lot of parachute journalism where people didn't have the expertise and they were reporting on a subject that they had just sort of come into and didn't know the longer history and weren't really attentive to migrant rights issues about what opportunities they had to bring about reforms. So just because we were starting to focus the scrutiny on it doesn't mean it was necessarily done in a professional, progressive kind of way, because it was so out of tune with what was happening, the advocacy that was happening around that issue within Qatar. So I think it's a more complicated story than just to say each event is an act of sports washing. Fundamentally, it's about soft power, it's about prestige, it's more about, sometimes about geopolitics, that Qatar wants to raise its profile vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and to establish itself as an international player. So it's not about deflection, it's about popularity, about nation branding, about these kinds of other kinds of concepts.
Is it about westernizing too, or no?
Well, for each international event, there's always a huge infrastructural plan, and that's one reason why states like having these international events, is then they can funnel a lot of budget towards large infrastructural sort of like development goals. So in Qatar, you had the building of stadiums, the building of new road infrastructures, a metro system. So they took advantage of it as a way to sort of mobilize a bunch of workforce and assets and national resources towards these kind of development goals. And this is the same story. I mean, London used the Olympics to basically wipe out immigrant communities in East London. And so in a way, it was like a developer sort of logic that happened there as well. And so cities are always reprogramming themselves around these events to accomplish stuff that they couldn't normally accomplish without a large event to justify it.
There is an interesting phenomenon taking place, though, which is more Western nations, basically democracies, don't want these big events.
I mean, sometimes,
because they don't want, maybe it's too expensive. They don't want the taxes. They don't want this. Like, God bless what LA's trying to do, but they're trying to do this without building a single new venue, which on one hand, yes, right? We already have, that's a mature community.
Yeah.
But I understand why a smaller country might think, hey, this is a good way for us to get on the map.
Exactly. And LA did it in 1984 without building a new venue. And they were trying to get the Olympics every Olympics competition since 1926.
Right.
So this is a long story. There's also, remember, there's city diplomacy as well. Cities want to elevate their stature. Mm-hmm. That's why Atlanta got the Olympics in 96, for example, or Montreal, I think, in 76.
Kelsey, how would you describe sports washing, and where have you seen versions of it?
Yeah, I think Will hit the nail on the head, but essentially it's a way to glorify, right, a country and try to erase some of the questionable parts of a country. So I think for me, the Olympics is the perfect example. Every time there's an Olympic game, there's always questions about why is this country being picked? And then, why are we putting sports on this platform? And why are we not talking about the other issues? And that's kind of why I honestly became a journalist, because I love the platform of sport, not just for the competition on the field, but because of all the other storylines around it. Like no other place than sports can we really all come together for a cause. And it's kind of the one time people kind of forget some of the injustices that take place. And so I think we see it honestly all the time, not just Olympic Games, but I mean, you can even look at right now what's happening here in this country. The National Football League, we have these conversations all the time. And I think sports washing is really interesting, because a lot of folks always say, I don't want sports and politics together, where essentially sports washing is really combining those two together. And those are the same folks that tell me, keep my politics out of sports. I just want to watch the games. But all that to say, I think with the upcoming games that we have, of course, coming up in Paris, and of course, I don't think Paris has as many questions, but I think we'll hit on, the nail on the head. Like Karen Bass right now is going to be dealing with a lot, the mayor of Los Angeles. We already saw her getting lots of questions about the homeless population being moved for preferable things happening in Los Angeles. And right now we're looking at France and Paris and looking at, what's going to happen there. Of course, we all know the statues and beautiful parts of Paris, but if you've ever been to Paris, like any city, there's a part that needs help, lots of people that need help.
Well, he brought up East London, and in theory, what the Olympic Committee in London was trying to say is, no, we're actually going to improve East London.
They try to say, right.
Right. It's always like, no, we're gonna bring all this investment, and as you said, it became just a form of gentrification.
Right.
Right. It was like
they'll pitch to journalists,
right.
Like,
Yes.
no, this is what they'll, this is what's in my email inbox. They want us to push those, kind of fluff stories. And that's why, again, that's why I got into teaching now. You want to ask those hard, real questions. What's really happening to those people? Go talk to those people, because again, usually they're just pushed aside, and everybody asks what happens once the game's in, right? What happens once the cameras are gone, once the reporters are gone, once the whole beat that was there is now gone. And I think that's kind of where this is why this panel is so important, because it's going to keep continuing to happen.
I want to talk with you about sort of this movement where teams hire journalists and the expectation of a journalist. And I say this because, look, let's the elephant in the room locally would be the Washington Commanders in the Dan Snyder era, right? He refused to work with the Washington Post. He was angry about the Washington Post. So in some ways he said, fine, I'm only going to release my injury updates to my reporters.
Right.
What describe sort of how you felt like having to work in that environment?
Yeah, so just for context, so I worked for the then Washington football team during the COVID era. So 2020, which was a crazy time to work for a sports team, because of course we were all learning.
Let alone that sports team too.
Let alone that sports team, yeah. So essentially I literally got hired after the whole scandal happened. The sexual assault that came out, and so I was there for a full season. And it's interesting, so I had worked for one previous team, so I also had worked for the Arena Football League, which is now defunct, as the Washington Valor team reporter, and so they played in Capital One Arena. So I've seen it on kind of a smaller football side, and then of course the Washington football team side. And I'll be honest with you, I have been very critical of the Washington football team my entire life, so getting that job was actually a little surprising, because again, if you go
They didn't Google?
Yeah, right. If you Google, and it's just because, so, just growing up in my household, so I always tell people, like, the story of kind of how I got into sports. I come from a family that is very, I know my history, right? So I knew the Commanders, then Washington Redskins, were the last team to integrate, right? So this is a team that was very interesting background, and now I'm all of a sudden working for this team. When you work for a team, you're personnel of the team. So everything that you put out there is being watched. So of course, you're not as critical of that team if you would like to keep your job. Now, there's positives of working for a team. Of course, I was freelancing, but you can work full-time for a team. I have lots of friends that are team reporters. You get full-time benefits, which is great, especially in the industry that we're in now. If you're unfortunately watching a lot of the news and what's happening to the sports media industry and getting smaller, and unfortunately journalists losing their jobs. But the positive side of it is that you really do get to get close to the players and tell kind of those personnel stories. So I had 2 digital shows, and I had one show on formerly, so we're saying that NBC Sports Washington, which of course is now owned and operated by Monumental Sports Network. So it was a unique time. Again, it was a little weird for me because I would go in about 3 days a week to Ashburn. I couldn't be there full time because, again, we had COVID protocols. So you couldn't always be, and I could only stay in the media part. And all of my interviews with players were actually virtual because, again, this is the height of the pandemic era. So it was a really unique time to work for them. But I have never been more cautious. And it's funny now, everybody will reach out to me and want to talk about the team. And of course, now I can really talk openly, right? I have no NDA or anything. And again, I'm a journalist, but during that time, I have never questioned, putting out a tweet or anything bad, just because I knew, again, I was a freelancer. And so when you're freelancing, it's much easier to get rid of you with the team. So essentially I didn't have a full contract, but I loved it. It was a great time. But during that era, and Dan Snyder, who was always getting questioned, it was hard because you have your personal ethics, right? And then you have the job that you're doing, and try to combine those two, Chuck, it was hard. It was honestly hard.
I've never tweeted about Comcast customer service for kids. There's certainly certain things you're like, or you're not. Avril, when you think about all the money that's coming in, okay, for the athlete in some ways, this has never been a better time because there's so much money flowing in, and it is in service to the athlete. Now, granted, maybe they only care about you if you're good, but but there is, and you take watching all the golfers with Live Golf, right? And like some had a moral line. I can't do it. Others said it's just money, and I'm going to be able to do things with my family that I wouldn't have been able to do without it. And everybody rationalizes, I think, when it comes to dollars. Right. But I could understand if athletes look at sports washing and say, look, it's helping support my sport, and I'm trying to grow my sport. What do you say?
I think it's interesting, at least when we look at sports washing in the context of trying to mask certain issues within, a country such as, Qatar. And we even saw it like back at the Brazilian, World Cup and even the Brazilian like Olympics, the Rio Olympics, with all of the different issues that arose with, displacing lots of like, the population and like, poor populations there, as well as, bringing up to rise the, labor rights and everything going on. And those, like, it's not a new thing. I think athletes bringing to light these issues is not a new occurrence. I think the fact that athletes are using their platforms in order to bring attention to, like, for example, for the Qatari World Cup, no one would have, known that all of these mistreatment of workers and, taking advantage, yes, of the event to create, amazing infrastructural, opportunities, but at the same time, the mistreatment of workers, I think, was a really good thing for athletes, to highlight. So in a way, sports washing, at least bringing, like, at least athletes to light with the issues that, are occurring and in the place that they're playing, I think is a really good platform. I think when it starts to become a little bit problematic is when we're using sports to, I guess, make light of the situation. I think it's really helpful when athletes use their platforms. I mean, we saw it with the United States women's national team with equal pay and bringing light to, their condition and, actually making a change of it.
All right, but let me ask you this. On the American team, athletes deciding to take a stand on pay versus, say, do you feel like that the women of the Venezuelan national team could do this?
I think that's a really good point, because then it's a matter of, like, I think it's very situational. Like, you have the U.S. women's national team, you have their success, they have things to pull from that's, we can comparatively look at the mistreatment of, like, women and men in, like, that pay gap because of the basis of their successes. Right. I think when you then go to, especially with the Venezuelan, like, national team, and seeing especially within, like, infrastructurally, within the team, you see a bunch of, like, even just talking with the, like, coaching staff, a lot of their day-to-day is going out into, like, the streets of Venezuela and trying to find talent in that way. Like, the funding is at a much lower level than you would say with the, like, U.S. team or even, like, some European
But do you feel
teams.
any of the country's politics pressure on the team? Do the coaches feel it?
I think most of it is actually I think that's actually part of the reason why, at least with Venezuela, and I think you see this with other teams now too, are starting to now, like, branch out and outsource their players. Like, for example, in the past year, you've had multiple camps, and that's part of the reason why I got scouted, was you've had multiple camps from Venezuela, like, come to the United States in order to recruit players that
Have Venezuelan, right? Venezuelan
have Venezuelan, like, heritage,
Yeah.
and they had camps out in Spain, for example, because of, a lot of the politics of Venezuela, unfortunately, displaced a lot of, Venezuelan people. So
I heard Messi early on was actually rejected by Argentinians because they thought he'd left Argentina too soon to go to a club in Spain.
No,
They never thought of. Now, of course, they love him, but that's
But yeah, no, I think you see a little bit of the intersection with the politics of, you have this incredibly difficult humanitarian crisis happening in Venezuela, which has had to, has essentially spurred this, migration of people that's,
Right.
I think, one of amongst, like, the third greatest in the world happening right now, where you have Venezuelan, people just leaving the country in mass waves.
you have the means and education, you've left.
Exactly. So I think, that's where you start to see the decisions start to become, let's start to, where is our talent now? So I think in that way, I think there's been a lot of that pressure with the Venezuelan national team, at least with trying to integrate players that, are all over the world now and not just on the streets of Venezuela, but also at least trying to make the issues, I think now it allows people, like, for example, like my parents who have had to unfortunately leave Venezuela, and, it gives me the platform in order to voice issues, about the humanitarian crisis there, especially since I still have family there.
But
so.
you feel like you can as a member of the national team.
Exactly. I think because I'm able to, like, because I've experienced this, because my family has experienced this, I think it's not, and this is not just me, I think other people as well. You see most famously Dana Castellanos, who's now a member of BAFC over at, for the National Women's Soccer League. You have people who are very outspoken about, who are not afraid to be outspoken about, the issues that are concerning not only our country, but also, the organization of like CONMEBOL and the different things that are going on there. So I think the opportunity to have those platforms has been incredibly helpful. But I think that, in going back to like the idea of sports washing, it also has to deal with it brings, if anything, I think athletes are starting to go more to a trend of bringing light to those issues rather than using the sport to be happy about it.
You know what all three of you have done here without realizing is that you've actually said, let's let a country sports wash. They're not going to be able to do it without us noticing.
Right.
And that if the event isn't there, you don't notice what they're doing. I mean, so Will, like you all in your own ways have made the argument that, hey, I'd rather a country try to do it because now we know a lot more about what happens to these Bangladeshi migrants. Am I being too Pollyannish about this, Will?
Well, like my view is that where the real sports washing is happening is not in events, and so I think events are just very risky for states. They are always subject to more scrutiny, and so
You're almost arguing that we're over scrutinizing these.
no, I'm all for scrutiny. I'm all for scrutiny. I'm all for responsible reporting on issues, but the issues that media tend to focus on to me aren't always the most important issues because they don't have the knowledge or the background of these places to really understand kind of what's going on. So they kind of come in and it becomes almost like a feeding frenzy around, this one issue when there's other glaring issues. I mean, migrant rights are important, but there's other things that you could sort of expose about Qatar, like, the natural gas and sort of petrol industry and its relationship to the climate issue, for example, or hosting CENTCOM where the U.S. invasion of Iraq was essentially administered from, but there was no interest in that, And Sochi, for example, obviously the gay rights issue is hugely important, but Sochi, was only part of Russia because of like mass genocides that Russia committed, and it still oppresses the people who live in that area. But that wasn't what was of interest at that time. So even when journalists feel like they're doing these critical exposés, they're always in very narrow, limited kind of ways that are more of a reflection of the journalist's interest in sort of the larger thrust of issues that are happening at that time. So I'm all for doing this kind of contextual reporting. It's great. Anyone who wants to host an event should not just get the prestige of it, but should be subject to the scrutiny. But I'm interested in kind of like the sports washing that happens with sponsorships, with the purchasing of teams.
Let's talk about this because the Qataris are involved in this too.
Yeah.
And the Gulf states, I mean, look at the English Premier League.
Yeah.
Okay, it is, how many of these teams are now owned by somebody with some connection to a sovereign wealth fund in the Gulf?
I mean, at least 3.
Yeah.
And you could say that Chelsea was before. It wasn't a sovereign wealth. It was an
Russian
oligarch.
tycoons involved in there, too.
Oligarch. Yeah.
Right. None of that. We're not even sure they got their money on the up.
Yeah.
Right.
But what's funny is that so the fans start to accept and actually appreciate that their clubs, like when Newcastle was bought, no one was complaining about Saudi's human rights records. It's like, oh, now Newcastle's going to be great because they're going to have all this money for spending, and it's totally skewed sort of the economics of the sport and hurt it in many ways, I think. But the real complaints are like for corporate owners that are just trying to squeeze money out of the club, for example, and don't invest in the club. That's what people focus on. They don't focus on these kinds of issues. So that's where sports washing actually happens.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I'll give you an example here. That's been something that's concerned me, Kelsey, and it's what the Qatari government investment in the Wizards and the Capitals.
Yeah.
Monumental Sports sold 5%, a 5% stake to the Qatari, essentially sovereign wealth fund.
Right.
In those leagues, they can go up to 20%.
Right.
That's inevitable. Monumental Sports will say, well, if we don't do it, somebody else will. They're probably right. okay? I'm not going to sit there and say that they're not. They look at it as a competitive, hey. And ultimately, if you're winning, the fans don't care.
Yeah, I think you just touched on it.
And
Josh.
I think it's a little unseemly that the Qatari government could control all DC sports entertainment for the lobbying community. Like that's what they don't need to own the team.
Right.
They just want to control the suites that invite the congressman and invite the bold-faced names to show up. And it's, that's where this seems to go.
It's so interesting. I remember when this first happened, there was a lot of conversation around it. And let's be honest, if the Wizards were a lot better, even if the Capitals were a lot better, people probably wouldn't even be caring about this issue. Sorry, DC sports fans, luck of the straw, hard times. But I think it's interesting. Like Ted Leonsis, I think when he first got the job, and many people compared him to Abe Pollin prior, and everybody saw this international visionary, like much different. I think Abe was more known for just doing good in the community. Like I honestly, till this day, I'm born and bred here in the DMV area, and only hear positives about Abe Pollin and really caring about the fans. Where I think now with Ted,
they didn't love him when he was owner. It's always funny to me. Yeah, you don't know what you got till they're gone.
Yeah.
I've seen more nice things said about Abe Pollin than they did when he was alive.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. So after the fact.
Yeah.
And with Ted Leonsis, I don't think it's that people dislike him. Well, maybe some people after he tried to move the team, right, to Virginia, now that they're back here. But I think, again, more people see him as a money man, right? I mean, even from the construction of the team, this is a team that has more international players. And, of course, the NBA is getting more international. But I think Ted, as you said, the Wizards and Capitals, you can look at them. They're both middle of the franchise valued. So not the top value teams in the league, but not at the bottom of the league. And Ted's always trying to move the needle forward. You see what he's built with Monumental Sports Network. I mean, kind of.
I think he'd love to add the Nats when they become available.
Yeah. And that's something that was also watching.
Right.
I was on shows talking about that.
And it looked like it was on the verge. That, in fact, the assumption was the extra cash from the Qatari government gave him the cash that he needed to get the Nats if the Nats would go through.
And that's what people were looking at, right? And then it was like, would it be fair if he could own all the teams essentially, right, in this area? And even now, there's lots of questions about the Monumental Sportsnet coverage, like we just talked about. Can you really be crucial of teams on a network that's owned by the same owner of the teams, right? So that's why it was a big deal when NBC Sports Washington was bought by them. But, I think when you look at it, the NBA had to get approved, right? NBA had to approve it. The National Hockey League also had to approve it. And
why do you think they approved it?
Sports are about money. Sports are about money. Yeah, we're all
watching all it did was raise the valuation.
Raise the value, and then there's lots of money. I know Will knows this. There's lots of money overseas. And right now, the NBA, they're always going to kind of be second fiddle, I think, to the National Football League, and everybody's trying to keep up. So what can they do? DC is an international city, I'd say more so. So I think Ted is trying to establish something. And like you said, if you go to a Wizards game, if you're lucky enough to see folks in the suites, it's very different here, than if I go to a game in Detroit or, any kind of other city. So all that to say, I think, again, he thinks with his, he's a money man. There's a reason why he can own the team, right? He makes smart business decisions, but it does raise a lot of questions. And it's interesting that nobody's kind of talking about it now, again, probably because all the other things happening with Monumental Sports. But I do think it's something to watch because, like I said, it's interesting. And again, first of the kind that we had seen this happen.
No, and I go back about why are they doing this? What is in the interest of the Qatari government? What would you say, Will? One out of this.
I mean, there's very different logics that happen. Sometimes it's purely investment. Sometimes it's purely political. In this case, I don't know enough about the details, but it could just as easily be to have an influential place within an American market.
They're not buying the Chicago Bulls.
Right.
They're not buying a piece of the Bulls, and they're not being
DC.
It does. I don't think it was an accident that it's DC.
Yeah.
It's very possible. I can't discount that. I mean, they've also invested heavily in PSG, the Paris soccer club. But I would point out that sometimes these kind of subtle maneuvers, sometimes they backfire. So, for example, the DC United went on a tour and played in Saudi Arabia as part of showcasing the new Saudi league, which has been heavily invested in. They've brought on players really prominent international players like Cristiano Ronaldo plays in Saudi. And so this was something that the fans were kind of upset with. And when I went to a game recently, the fan club had a giant banner that was for Jamal Khashoggi.
No kidding.
Yeah, and that was on display at the stadium.
Did you talk to the club about it?
So that
Did they?
I haven't spoken.
It's one of
to
those
the
things
club.
I'm curious if the club thinks, boy, maybe we shouldn't have done this one.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know, especially because the fans were a good portion of the fans were very upset about it. So a lot of these sort of subtle maneuvers lead to backfire.
No, I was kind of thinking about, as we were talking about the Qataris, and thinking about like you said, like these really and at least thinking about what does it come down to? It comes down to the money. Like you have, players like Cristiano Ronaldo, Karim Benzema going to these like Saudi leagues. Well, what are they going there for? They're going like there for the money. Yeah. And I really feel like, at least from the athlete perspective, the use of the Saudis for these like high profile names to bring them over with the money, it's like almost taking advantage of like, wow, we have all this money, let's actually use it to our advantage to make ourselves look like we have, a very I guess put together like soccer league that can compare to La Liga, Premier League, things like that. And it's almost in a way trying to make up for the fact that, we have these kind of questionable, human rights issues. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of see them like continuing to use the platform of those really high profile players in order to maybe try to make this 2025 Women's World Cup bid, which ultimately fell through. But you kind of see that with bringing in these high profile players, it's, using the money that they have in order to like really try to capitalize on making themselves look like a much better like country in a way, which then I think starts to become more problematic, especially when you start to introduce women into the issue and trying to make this Women's World Cup bid. It just doesn't make sense, at least.
Well, I want to stick with women's sports here because the Brittany Griner incident
Exactly.
was, a lot of people say, why was she there in the first place?
Right.
Well, she was there because she was getting compensated to play basketball in Russia at a much higher price than she was being compensated in the WNBA. I mean, we're sort of, I'm sure, like many of you, I'm as into the women's tournament as I am the men's tournament. Probably more so right now the women's tournament. And I'm learning about how poor the salaries are in the WNBA. Yeah. And you're like, oh, stay in college one more year, you can make more money, right? Above the board, not even below the board anymore. So if you're Brittany Griner, pre-captivity, we're sitting here talking about sports washing. She's going, hey, I'm getting an opportunity to play overseas that my country won't give me.
Right.
That's a dilemma.
Right.
If you're Brittany Griner. No?
Yeah, and I think Avril hit, then, for women, it's so different, right? I mean, I was an athlete once, but for me, I knew my options. I didn't want to play overseas. I'll just be honest. So for me, I wanted to more so focus on the journalism aspect. Now, I had a cousin that played volleyball professionally overseas, so I've seen that life, up close and personal. But Brittany Griner, we're talking about one of the top.
It's a pretty impressive short-term living, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay,
and
it's probably the way to put it.
Brittany Griner is like an anomaly, right? Because she's a great WNBA player, right? I mean, this is not going to be the truth for all WNBA players. Brittany Griner, at the top of her game, but still, again, wanting to make a living. And, we see her all across the TV.
She had to get a side hustle.
She had to get a side hustle, right? She's like the rest of us, right? A lot of us, right, that have side hustles. And, people, that's what everybody said. Well, why was she in Russia? And these are a lot of folks who, of course, haven't paid attention to the women's game, right, that might not know that. And let's remember, when Brittany Griner went to college, this was pre-NIL, right? So she wasn't making all of this money at Baylor that we're seeing, a Caitlin Clark now valued at $3.1 million, or Angel Reese valued at $1.8 million in college. So essentially, Brittany, she's married. She's trying to provide for her family, right? Like any other person. And so, I mean, overseas, and I've been to games overseas, it's unreal sometimes. Like now, I think a lot of other folks who weren't following the women's game are doing it here, and Avril, you might know this, but there's a lot of love for women's sports, not in all countries, but overseas, and I think that she was, appreciated in a way. And then there was the fact that, like, yes, Brittany Griner, her sexuality, but I think when she was playing over there, it wasn't the big deal, was that she was a great basketball player. That became more of a story once everything happened, of course, in Russia, once she got locked up, and once people started digging into her background, as we tried to find figures, previously her head coach, Kim Mulkey, trying to tell, that.
But then we're finding out, like, okay, who's her benefactor? And it's some questionable people.
Yeah,
right?
But like you said, it's so interesting. But I think when these young ladies are making these decisions, like, I mean, they're trying to make a living, right? I mean, you're looking at some WNBA salaries. Maybe if you're lucky, you're getting $100,000. If you're a really good player, you have sponsorship dollars. But still, I mean, we live in Washington, D.C. I don't know if the $100,000 is adequate enough for an average person, right, to live here, yet alone somebody who, if you go to Mystics games, you're playing prime in the summer. We're right around the corner from the WNBA draft. You have new players coming in each time, vying for your spot, right? It's a smaller league. So all that to say, I think Brittany Griner, and the issue was so interesting because I've never seen so many people talking about, women playing overseas and actually trying to understand that issue up until that point. And even now it's become a
No, it's a good thing, it's a terrible thing that happened,
right,
but it educated us.
It made us have the conversation.
That's right.
Right, and we're still having the conversation.
Well, and it's coming back, what I keep coming back to is that as much as I think all of us are uncomfortable with how some of these countries who don't share our values, it has actually forced us to have to look at some things that maybe we wouldn't be staring at.
Right.
So, Will, I guess, how much should our values matter here when it comes to these sports relationships? So let's take Live Golf. On one hand, you had Joe Biden say he wants to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state. So he said on the campaign trail. Then the reality of gas prices hit him in the face, and inflation, and suddenly, you know, we're trying to figure out how to make nice with them as a country. At the same time, you've got activist sports media, say my friend Tony Kornheiser, who called it the Saudi Tour, and he won't call it the Live Tour, he calls it the Saudi Tour. And he's making a point, like, is this what you want to be? Yet, I'm sitting here, should I judge Phil Mickelson if my government is trying to make nice with the Saudis, but I'm going to sit here and tell Phil Mickelson, despite the American government who's trying to make nice with the Saudis, you shouldn't take their money. Shame on you.
Yeah.
But the United States government is taking their money.
Yeah.
Right? So I guess the question is what, you know, where should our values, should government legislate our values in this case? I don't know.
I think journalists, you know, have to model criticism in all directions. I think that we don't apply the same filter to overseas actors as we do to ourselves. And I'm not saying that we should therefore be quiet about what other governments are doing and about the values they espouse. It's just that we have to be critical of our own. And that we, you know, if we actually approached every event in that the U.S. is sponsoring as we approach those events happening, whether it's by Qatar or Saudi Arabia or whoever, if we applied the same kind of lens, we would have a totally different storytelling going on with our own events. And so that's my
Probably
call.
with every sports team.
And every sports team.
Not
as
just,
well.
right, every
Yeah.
single sports owner might have something that they have to answer for.
Yeah, so I think you know, we have a lot of issues in this country around human rights. I mean, the list could go on from the prison population to police violence and abuse to crime that happens on the streets. And a lot of people might be scared to come to the U.S. because of maybe the image that they have abroad. But I think these events are an opportunity for us to ask the same questions of ourselves.
Are we participating in sports washing by hosting the World Cup and hosting, you know, I guess one person's sports wash is another person's showcasing a value.
Let me tell you an interesting story. In 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Moscow Olympics out of what? Out of solidarity with the poor people of Afghanistan who were just subject to the Soviet invasion. When we submitted our bid for the World Cup more than 15 years ago, the U.S. was actually invading Afghanistan. Right? So my point is that
I see where you're going there. Yeah.
We have to understand that all this judgment that we put out towards other countries, it only makes sense if we also use the same judgment internally.
Agreed.
To me. And we could actually model that as something that makes, you know, the United States in a way great. Right? We have this First Amendment tradition. We have the rights and the freedoms to do it, but for some reason we fall silent, and I think that's not productive.
How would you be tackling this?
I think, well, you're so right, because I'll hear people talk about, Qatar and women's rights issues, but we're dealing with abortion issues right here in America. So I think it's right. People have the lens on the outside world. It's kind of, you point one finger out and four are pointing back at you, but nobody wants to look at those fingers pointing back at them. And again, what we're dealing with right now, like you said, police brutality, for instance. We have athletes standing up and speaking out on that. And I mean, only so much is being done. It's kind of, literally we had somebody tell, one of the greatest athletes in the world to shut up and dribble, but let another country say that to a top athlete, and we're, clutching our pearls. So I think it's really interesting, but, I think again, the conversation is important, but I think, this is a unique school, for instance. I think, my students here have much more of a foreign lens than a lot of people
There's an international
Right.
city and the school. I felt this
Right.
way going here. Like,
Yeah.
look, I didn't know what Ramadan was until I came.
Until you came here, right?
And
So
then,
you're exposed to a
right,
lot,
exactly.
yeah.
I mean,
But
and
that's
that was,
not everybody's,
I'd heard of it, but I didn't
yeah.
participate in it. And being able to understand it, this is a unique
It is.
school for
Yeah.
this, which is that. By the way, we're supposed to have a mic out there, so if you could line up, and we'll be taking a few questions in a minute. But Avril, I want you to sort of weigh in on this, on the, I guess the idea of, do you think you will, if you decide to go into some form of professional athlete, how much will the value of the person that pays you matter to you?
Right.
Their values. You know, I say this because if you work for a corporation, all right, I guess I can judge Comcast values.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe not necessarily the individual. I don't know. I assume it's not a black and white answer.
No, and it's definitely not a black and white answer, especially with, like we were talking about earlier, especially with different countries and their handling, I guess, of, you know, women's sports specifically. I think you see, you know, we see a really great, encouraging influx of investment into the women's game across the world. But you still have, like, specifically talking about, like, in an athletic lens, having the opportunity to go overseas to Spain, Germany, Sweden, France, I mean, for me, that's something that I would love to take in order to expand my game and be able to experience what it's like to play different styles.
Right.
That's athletically. Now, having, you know, experience going to France, going to Spain, especially in the Spanish game where, for example, there are tons of, you even see it in the men's game too, tons of discrimination and racism surrounding their players that, to me, makes it incredibly alarming, especially when you have tons of players from, you know, Brazil having to deal with racism and discrimination on the daily. And, you know, as a Hispanic going to Spain, I've seen it multiple times with some of my family's friends, for example, having to deal with these, like, specific issues in general. But I guess if you see, specifically on the money side of things, you know, and I guess that goes back to the whole idea of, like, what we were talking about earlier of, you know, these really high profile players going to Saudi Arabia and going for the money. Now, does it discredit the idea that they're just going there for the money, they're not gonna, like, you know, spread light on the specific issues that are going on there? Well, maybe, you know, they are. But if I were to be the athlete to, you know, have the opportunity to go like overseas, you know, athletically, my first idea is yes. But, you know, thinking about the ramifications and consequences of my decision, you know, on not only the social issues I might be, like, perpetuating, and as well as the, you know, political issues from the people that are paying me, you know, eventually there's that little, like, conscience
Look,
that, you know.
A piece of advice I might give you if you were thinking about this is, like, look, you're forever going to be indebted to them.
Exactly.
Are you comfortable with that?
And especially, like,
right? And
you know,
some of these countries, I don't know if I would be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, like, you know, going into, like, especially as an athlete that also wants to hopefully go into journalism one day, you know, having that, like, you know, breadcrumb trail of, you know, oh, I was paid by a company who has some very, you know, I guess questionable, you know, ties to, you know, different issues. That is certainly something that you're going to have to, you know, play and I think, like, you know, take into consideration. And especially, like, with younger people, I think they don't honestly realize that until it's too late. For me, it's been something that I've had to kind of deal with my entire life. Like,
we used to be focused on the big stuff. I remember we boycotted Exxon and Coors. That was what we did in college.
Right.
We were angry at Coors and Exxon. I knew why Exxon. I never understood Coors.
Right.
His first name was Adolf. Yeah, I think that was.
But we, like, for example, like, I grew up in a very competitive, like, soccer environment where everything that, I mean, I was trying to get recruited for a college team since I was, like, 12 years old, to be honest. And everything that I did had, you know, consequences on that. Like, what I posted on social media had consequences on that. You know, what I, you know, say to some of my peers have consequences on that. What am I telling one, you know, college recruiter that they could be telling their peers about me, for example? So, and that honestly translates to the media world as well. Like, what, you know, I've also had to be conscious as a student journalist. What am I, you know, highlighting? What am I, you know, supporting? What am I doing to?
What's something we like to brag about with the Hatchet? It's independently owned.
Exactly.
Not owned by the school.
Mm-hmm.
You know how many student newspapers are owned by the school? And it's a different story, right? It's just
Exactly.
a different, so we brag about it there. The independent, it's a badge of honor
Exactly.
to know that it's an independent entity.
So, like, at least, like, carrying both that, like, athletic and, you know, media part into it, I think that's when it starts to become very conscious of, you know, where is the money going? What relationships do I want to have behind me when I am, looking forward? So
Let's throw out, I know we got a few questions here. Go ahead.
Okay, I had two questions. So the first one was, so I understood you talk about like how countries tend to host these events in order to show like their greatness or their prowess, or like that they can facilitate a big, large international event. But couldn't that be a prerequisite? Because despite human rights abuses, they put out these events. Like, we all understood that Nazi Germany, for example, was a big rising fascist power. Maybe it's because they wanted to display that greatness in spite of, the fascist history that they had. Or similarly with Qatar, naturally they would want to display their greatness, but in spite of the issues that were already occurring. And secondly, I know we like to criticize the players or fans that, honestly, I don't think they should be receiving any guilt for supporting a team that might have any connection with an individual or a sovereign wealth fund that might have ties to human rights abuses. But at the same time, when are we going to start criticizing governing bodies like FIFA? Like, why are we giving them the opportunity to give a random country that is hosting these events that have ties to human rights abuses? Why are we giving the Olympics the opportunity to give it to Brazil, which, by the way, did not have the financial ability to even host these Olympics, and even afterwards they had a lot of problems with the favelas, for example. So I just wanted you to touch on the governing bodies. Yeah.
I think that the governing bodies is great, but answer the first
Yeah.
question.
Well, he's wearing a Juve jersey, so I don't know if I can. No, I think you're right. I mean, it's all about demonstrating that we can pull it together. We have the command of logistics. We're a well-functioning society. It's all part of the story. And so maybe what you hear about us is not telling the whole truth, because look at this amazing event we can put on. So I agree with you, your narrative of that. But I do want to point out one thing, which is that we can't keep having these international events be in the same few countries in Europe and North America every time. And a lot of this has to do with access to these events. I don't know if most people aren't aware of this, but to be from South America, or to be from the Middle East, to be from Africa, it's not easy to get a visa to come to the United States. And it also is cost prohibitive in many ways. When you have it in a place like Qatar, which gives visas much more freely to these parts of the world, a lot of fans were able to go to these events that wouldn't normally be able to travel otherwise. So sometimes we overlook these kinds of things. Or to have it in Brazil opens up the participation for a whole other continent. To have it in South America, the same story. So I think we have to think about these other kinds of factors as well.
I actually look at the Brazil decision and think, wow, that's one time the IOC didn't think with its wallet first.
Yeah.
Because it was not it would have been a lot easier to go to, they might have been able to get more money out of South Africa, frankly. But we had not had one in South America. This was an important thing. Brazil's one of the largest countries in the world. How has Brazil not hosted one of these, right? It's one of the few times I'd love to attack FIFA and the IOC.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is a corruptness. There's certainly a corruptible influence, but weirdly, what you point out with Rio, I think they were trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
They didn't do it well, but I think they were trying to do the right thing.
Well, the U.S. went very aggressively to take on FIFA for corruption after it lost that bid, because how could we lose a bid, So I think the international federations, I mean, corruption in sports is they go hand in hand since from time immemorial. It's very hard to clean them up.
The Salt Lake Games, we got accused of purchasing that from the IOC.
Yeah, I was
Not
gonna
just,
say.
I mean, and it was a scandal in this country. And Mitt Romney had to go clean up the Olympics because of what Salt Lake City did. But why would Salt Lake City really want to host those games? It needed to prove it was a major American city. And that it could, for the same reason why does Qatar want to do this, right? Same reason.
Right.
How do you feel about FIFA, Avril? Because FIFA is very, I don't know any soccer fan, excuse me, football fan who likes FIFA.
I don't think I know one either, to be honest. No, it's really interesting, and I think you start to see this a little bit more come to light, at least in the past few years, especially with, I remember, I can't think of the documentary name at the time, but there was a documentary that came out a few months ago about, it's a multi-episode one that basically touched on the different levels of corruption that have been going on for historically throughout FIFA. And it's not even just by, placing the World Cup and, like we were talking about with the Brazil World Cup, and not infrastructurally being able to financially, be in a place to, actually have it there. But I think also with FIFA, you start to see very, I guess, questionable decisions with the women's game as well, and its expansion around the world. And it goes hand in hand as well with the corruption going on, I guess, like regional levels as well. You see tons and tons of corruption with CONCACAF, with CONMEBOL, with the Asian
We don't pay
and
attention
African
to those tournaments at
Asia-
all.
Asia
with, the,
Cup,
with
You know,
Asian,
unless
with
our
Africa
teams
as
lose
well.
in it and it costs a World Cup bid. What? You know.
Then you
Exactly,
Yeah.
but I think it's like it goes hand in hand with the FIFA officials, but also the ones in charge of these confederations. And it's not just FIFA. I think we also need to like start. And I mean, it's been going on for years, but I think continue to be critical of the like confederations who are like actively not expanding the game in ways that FIFA promises, which I think is like the
But
like,
look,
most
I
essential
mean,
thing.
we have all these international bodies have struggled. I mean, the UN is the number one example of this, right?
Mhm.
When we don't share values globally, and you're trying to act in some sort of global committee, you're going to end up, frankly, it's almost easier to just go to the highest bidder.
Yeah.
I mean, is that?
Yeah, I think we have to remember sports is like the one universal love language, right, that every country has. And so I do
No, it's a positive currency. Yes.
positive currency.
Yes.
But I do think there is high criticism of FIFA and the IOC. But what happens is it dies down once the games begin. We love
Yeah.
sports. Take yourself back to COVID when there was no sports. People will do anything to watch the power of live sports, and I think they know that. The criticism's there, the media
Watch
cycle.
Korean baseball, for God's sake.
You're watching anything.
Remember that with the
Media
fake
cycle's
fans?
always going. Yeah. So
I mean,
they know that.
yeah. Once Messi won the World Cup, everyone forgot about it.
Then we all forgot everything.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you all very much. My question is, do you think that the pattern of giving these big events, Olympics, World Cups to certain countries could act as a reward for bad behavior? You mentioned the 2014 Olympics, which were in Russia. I want to say 2 weeks after the Olympics, Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea
Right.
and began his first invasion of Ukraine. Yet in 2018, Russia got the World Cup. You could say the same thing with
Well,
Azerbaijan and Formula One. They attacked Armenia in 2020. They still have hosted the Baku Grand Prix, I want to say 3 years afterwards. So do you think in a way that this habit of giving these big high-profile events to certain countries who have a clear policy, it could be a war against their neighbors or whatever, it like rewards the leaders in charge?
You have to remember that they bid like a decade before. So Russia gets Sochi in 2007 and then invades Georgia 2008. So I think just the time, it's about when the bid is accepted versus,
But there's a reason why. There's a bigger issue here, and it goes to the mature democracies don't bid for these things anymore because there is hesitation over the taxes that it takes. There isn't, it isn't if you're asking for the public's financial help, they're like, no, I'm not giving any more of these tax dollars. So it is the second world countries, however you want to do this, right? Who want to prove, hey, we've got the money to be first world.
Yeah.
Watch us.
Yeah, because these aren't profitable ventures. Politicians always promise we're going to make all this money from them. Very rarely do they do. So it's got to be someone who's willing to pay, and so who's willing to pay. And the other thing I do want to say is that there's some things about fan experience that sometimes authoritarian regimes are slightly better at. Like crime is always very low. The trains always run on time. The homeless people are put out of sight. This is like actually fan experience is not about democracy. Fan experience is about a well-ordered society and people serving us
What
as
was
fans.
the Ted Leon's biggest complaint about being in Chinatown?
The crime.
No,
I thought it was the crime.
No, it was the music.
The drummers.
Oh, the guys
Yeah,
outside.
it was mostly about the
Can't take
drummers.
away the culture.
Yeah, are they going
Well,
he
there's
might
something.
clear it out if it was in a different regime. Right?
Exactly. So these things aren't incompatible in my mind. The fan experience
Yeah.
and
It-
the politics of
It is,
the
I guess,
society.
though, but let me go to his question. Let's say we want to express our values. We are the richest country. Do we just simply boycott if we want to try to change the behavior of FIFA, change the behavior of these? If we don't think they're doing that this is, hey, you're only hurting the larger cause of more freedom for the globe. Should we be more activist as a country? I don't think you think we should. Avril, where would you go?
I think again, that's something that's really like gray, I guess, is once you start to pull out of these events, like what does that at least mean for the athletes who actually want to push these, like,
Look,
but then again,
if we had boycotted the 1936 Olympics, Jesse Owens would be an unknown person.
exactly, and that's the thing. Like,
That's a bad thing.
yeah, and that's the thing. Like, you have these athletes who are like wanting to not only like make statements for their country, but also make statements for themselves. Especially the Jesse Owens.
What if Greg Louganis had also been able to compete in 1980? He would have won a bunch of medals,
Right.
and being a prominent gay man in America, having won medals in Russia in 1980.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
It would have been quite a statement.
Of all things. I think that's why it's so hard because, like you said, we have our values and we think our values are right, and every country thinks their values are right, right? We think our religions are right. Other countries think their religions are right. But I think the power, this is again why sports are so powerful. It's your way to kind of dictate to the world that you're the best. And so honestly, I hear people all the time say, I'm going to boycott this, I'm going to boycott that. It never happens because again, the power of sport. And I just don't see, the U.S. I mean, when you think about
The only
US,
time we boycott sports?
what is that?
When they lose.
When they lose, right?
Because what happens? We don't show up.
We don't show up.
That's when we boycott. There's a whole bunch of people boycotting the Wizards right now.
Yeah.
I actually didn't. And it isn't because they were moving to Virginia
right.
for 10
it's
seconds.
because they're not the best.
It's
true.
because it's Jordan Poole Sting.
Yeah, I mean, I would just point out that like we have democratic values, about a culture of dissent. But try bringing a political poster to a sports event. They walk you out of walk you out of the stadium.
Right.
So our values are very partite and locational based and very selective.
Well, we compartmentalize it for.
Yeah.
What else? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name
This
is
the last one? Okay, you were the last question. Better be a great one.
Well, no,
Pressure's on.
I'm glad that I can ask you this question. I just have a very specific question about the Qatari case you mentioned about, especially regarding the homosexual one. And I would like to play this like voice of the Qatari Emir on this.
Okay.
And concerning the World Cup, you said you're looking forward to the German guests. Are you also looking forward to homosexual German guests, or do they have to stay home?
Listen, everybody's welcome in Doha. We do not stop anybody from coming to Doha with any different backgrounds, any different belief. Qatar is a very welcoming country, and the World Cup is a great opportunity for people from different parts of the world to come and experience our culture. We will not stop anybody from coming, visiting, and enjoying the football. We all live in one planet, but each of us have different cultures. We welcome everybody, but also we expect and we want people to respect our culture.
So my question regarding this comment is that how do we respect the cultural relativism when we talk about sports washing?
I think this is the trickiest question.
Yeah.
Respecting another person's belief that doesn't believe perhaps you should exist. That's a tough. That's
a tough question. I mean, it goes in all different directions too. Like in France, they host a major event, but they have legal prohibitions against overt signs of religiosity. Like you're not supposed to wear a cross. I mean, they don't enforce that. They enforce it against women wearing hijabs and that kind of thing. So then that leads to a question like if you, when you're going to someplace else, do you respect it or not? And that's itself sort of a cultural question. I think some people think, no, I'm going to be an activist about it. I'm going to challenge it. We saw, like Grant Wall, for example, God rest his soul. He died in Qatar, but he wanted to advocate for LGBTQ, so he wore the shirt with the rainbow color on it. And it was a very sort of just like, simple display of protest, and he was forced to turn the shirt inside out. So that was, I thought, a very polite way to sort of register some kind of protest without committing like a cultural offense that was really, meant to insult the people or that kind of thing. I mean, also I would point out, having been to Qatar many times, is that there is an LGBTQ scene in Qatar, but it's private, it's quiet, and that's not the ideal way that a culture or subculture should necessarily exist. Like it's bad that they can't show rainbow flags, for example. but it's also not as dire as, there's not like a police officer in everyone's bedroom making sure that, So I think there's some nuance there about what's appropriate in terms of public culture that sometimes Americans are not so fully attuned to. But we can always think about, what would we expect our culture to be respected by people who are coming as visitors?
Yeah, I have always viewed it as, am I house sitting? Am I visiting somebody's house?
Yeah.
What is, as an athlete, how would you view it?
No, and that's what I think. Like, you have, a place like Qatar where actually being respected as like a, human being is the first issue you want to like address when you're actually going to be playing in these kinds of events. But I think also it's the responsibility of the country, like hosting, if we're bringing in all of these people with completely different backgrounds, completely different cultures to us, we should be in a place where if they're going to come in and respect our culture, we have to respect the ones that they're bringing into this event as well. So I think, the example you had with Grant Well, for example, of him like actively, having a very peaceful like way of just like, actually supporting LGBTQ people in this, capacity, I think is a great way also to show the fact that, these athletes, are human beings. And if you're not going to respect the fact that, they might have these backgrounds or cultural things and then bringing it into this country for your event, it's also on the responsibility of the country to respect it on both sides. I think that's what it goes to the end, like it's respect on both sides.
I was just thinking about a trip I made to Riyadh. The only time I went to Riyadh with the president. It was President Obama at the time. And where we stayed, they created a women's restroom.
Wow.
They didn't have one, but they created one because they decided so it was an interesting decision.
Yeah.
Like the women that were traveling, they were, it was all of like, and the White House press corps did a good job of trying to convince, hey, look, but that was it mitigated what would have been a very uncomfortable situation. Where are you on this?
I mean, I think it's hard. It's tough because do you go to a country and do you ask them to bend their values to welcome you? Is that fair? The same way when we welcome people, right? Like we have Pride nights, for instance, at games here. I have known people sometimes that say they don't want to go to the games during those Pride nights, but yet we're a country that says we embrace, LGBTQ rights. And so I think it's hard too because you have to also remember a country's values is not everybody in that country's values. Like Will said, there's a private scene there, so obviously not everybody's against LGBTQ rights there, but it's like how do you tell a government what to do, like you said, if you're going to their spot, but you still want to remain fair? That's the question I think we'll try to continue answering for the rest of the time. But unfortunately right now there is no answer. So that's kind of why we have our own personal values. Each country has their values. And it's just what are you willing to do? Obviously Grant took a chance doing that. There were other journalists there who I know, who were also LGBTQ, but they didn't want to risk that, right? Because they knew where they were. And they were afraid, to kind of, speak out about that. He's obviously more vocal. It kind of goes to if you're a journalist or personality.
And I would say, look, and we all have to make certain decisions. He had a high enough profile where he thought he could get away with it without it becoming an international incident, right? Sure. Not these other journalists may not have been.
Right, and we're talking about right. We might have not been talking about that exactly.
Right.
So there's so many different factors in here. I think it's a great question. It's just really hard to answer.
This was terrific. I really the questions were great. This topic and it sort of I'm sort of glad we have sports washing because you've convinced me that in some ways it allows us to have the more honest conversations about our values, whether it's ours, the globe's values, another country's values. So there's some. It is almost it's a good controversy in that it forces us to have these conversations, but we don't have a good answer to respond to it because, as we've all learned, there's only one color that matters, and it's green.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Well,
Appreciate it.
Thank you.